One of the most infamous traitors of the Second World War was Lord Haw Haw, William Joyce. He was a British broadcaster who defected to Nazi Germany, and he produced anti-British and pro-Nazi propaganda and radio shows, which aimed to destroy the morale of the British during the war, and as Germany crumbled, Joyce went on the run to try and save his life. After hiding out with his wife for some time, he was arrested by the British, being shot as he was seized, and after recovering and being tried, he was executed inside of Wandsworth Prison on the gallows. Joyce's execution is still debated today, as the circumstances of his execution and whether he was actually a traitor is controversial, but inside of France there was a pro-Nazi broadcaster who worked on similar radio shows inside of Paris. Herold Paquis was the French Lord Haw Haw, and he became known for his pro-German vitriol, which was broadcasted to the French who were living under a tough German occupation. He was a collaborator with the Nazi authorities, and at the end of the war he was taken to a French fort, where he was stood opposite a firing squad who ruthlessly shot into their target. Welcome to The Untold Past. Today we look at the execution of the French Lord Haw Haw, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Jean-Auguste Herold Paquis was born in Arches on the 4th of February 1912, and as a young boy he lost both his parents and he left school without any qualifications. As a teenager, Paquis had a strong interest in journalism, and at the age of 16 he joined a political newspaper as a journalist and a writer, and he wrote for different papers before he moved to Paris in 1932. He worked with other writers and began to develop a notorious reputation for himself, and he then transitioned to working inside of the radio. He was a columnist for a Catholic show, but he was no angel. Jean was at some point in the 1930s arrested and convicted of a number of crimes, including fraud, defamation, and having a mistress inside of a married home, and in 1937 he then joined the Bandera Joan of Arc, and this was a group of nationalists who fought during the Spanish Civil War for General Francisco Franco. Hundreds of French men went and fought in the Spanish conflict, and they were a small unit, but they tried to recruit more members inside of France. Some of these men would fight during the Second World War and displayed the symbols of the Bandera Joan of Arc. Inside of Spain, Paquis continued to work on the radio, and from April 1938 until March 1939, he spoke on Radio Zaragoza in a French-language radio show, and he created the Association of Friends of this radio station, which had 18,000 members. But as the Second World War began to erupt inside of Europe, Jean was invited to meet Marshal Pétain, and they spoke about him becoming the French ambassador to Spain. However, inside of France, Jean Paquis began to collaborate with the German enemy. Between the 10th of May and the 22nd of June 1940, a huge German assault was launched on France, and this led to the nation being placed under German occupation, and this saw the pushback of the British Army and remaining forces to Dunkirk. The attacks by the Germans pushed through defensive French lines and caused chaos and confusion, and the French forces and government collapsed. This was a huge victory for Hitler and the Germans, and it would not be until D-Day that the nation would begin to experience a relief of liberation. France was divided following the signing of the armistice into a German occupation zone in the north and a French-governed zone in the south, known as a Vichy. The persecution of people inside the nation began as a number of people, including Jews, began to be attacked, and they would then be displaced and sent to the concentration camps. Jean then began to side with the Allies, and he was pushed into collaboration with the Germans following an attack on the French squadron by the British at Mers el-Kabir. He sided with the Germans and became a sympathiser of the Nazi politics, and he went further, promoting ideas of National Socialism. He also was involved in the creation of a French section inside the Waffen-SS. But during the occupation, Jean Paquis became especially known for working on Radio Paris. He produced and featured in a popular pro-German broadcast which followed the 8 o'clock radio news, and hundreds of thousands of people listened. His broadcasts mentioned the successes of the Axis forces and promoted the Nazi occupation and the allies of the Nazis, and his rhetoric attacked the British, American and others. He claimed in these broadcasts that England, like Carthage, would be destroyed, and he was critical of the Vichy regime, and he wanted further Nazi officials in power. He was producing incredibly strong Nazi propaganda, and this was of course treason, and as the war turned against the Germans following D-Day, as more different areas and regions of France became liberated, the nets began to close in on Jean Paquis. He was someone who was searched for by the French authorities and was seen as a major war criminal. In August 1944 he fled from France and went towards Germany, knowing that this would give him a significant amount of protection from the resistance. Inside of Hitler's lands, he was given some respite, but he continued to take part in radio broadcasts from Germany. But when the country was invaded as the Allies pushed through the lines, Jean Paquis tried to yet again flee, and he actually gave up a place on a plane, which would have seen him taken to Spain alongside other collaborators such as Pierre Laval. He made other plans and then tried to enter Switzerland, but instead he was arrested and was passed over to the French on the 8th of July 1945. He was a very wanted man, and as mentioned, comparisons with Lord Haw Haw, the British traitor and radio broadcaster, who was also condemned to death, can be made. Jean was brought in front of a courtroom and was accused of treason, and the prosecution itself did not produce any witnesses, but instead played large parts of his broadcasts to the courtroom, and these were said to have been enough to prove the charge of treason, as he was attempting to demoralise the French people and promote the Nazi regime. Paquis tried to defend himself, saying he was happy that the Allies won the war and defeated the Germans, and he said he was a victim of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and when asked where he was being held, he replied, "I'm in the camp of the defeated, Mr. Government Commissioner." He was someone who was clearly guilty, and for this he was sentenced to death for treason against the French nation, was then sent back to prison to await his death sentence. He appealed for clemency, but this was rejected, and on the 11th of October 1945, Jean Herold Paquis was taken to Fort Châtillon for his execution. This was a fortification found south of Paris, and it was here where a number of prominent Second World War figures were executed. He was led out into the rubble of the fort, which was heavily damaged during the war, and there was a firing squad gathered to take his life. He was just 33 years old when he was led towards his execution, and in a clearing he went to his execution a broken man. It was later claimed that he went to the post crying and weeping heavily, and screaming that they did not shoot others who had committed crimes. He was tied to a post opposite the firing squad, who were stood with their rifles, and then the officer in charge of the soldiers told his men to ready, and they raised their rifles towards Jean Paquis. The officer then gave the order to fire, and the executioners shot straight into their target, the French Lord Haw Haw. Inside of prison days before his execution, Jean wrote a book which told about living under the final days of Nazi government and regime in Paris. He was someone who defected to the Nazis during the conflict, and he took action to gain favour with the Germans, and he was involved in making prominent radio broadcasts which aimed to demoralise the French and the Allies and to empower the Germans. He was a propagator of Nazi hatred, and he knew at the end of the war that he was a wanted man. He fled to Germany and continued to collaborate, then tried to get into Switzerland but was handed over to the French. He was seen by many as a terrible traitor for his actions, and he was taken to the firing range inside of a French fort where a number of executioners, armed with their rifles, brought the life of Jean Herold Paquis to an end. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.